New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Emmy Vadnais, co-host with Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is Zen and Koan with my guest, Henry Shukman, who is a teacher in the Sanbo Zen lineage and is trained in various other meditation schools and practices. He has been authorized to teach mindfulness meditation by Shinzen Young and is a certified dreamwork therapist. He is the spiritual director emeritus of Mountain Cloud Zen Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He is also a poet who has been published in the New Yorker and the New York Times. He is the co-founder of the Way app. Henry is author of several books, including Original Love, The Four Inns on the Path of Awakening, One Blade of Grass, Finding the Old Road of the Heart, a Zen memoir, In Dr. No's Garden, and Mortimer of the Maghreb. This is Henry's second interview with New Thinking Aloud. If you enjoy this program, please like, subscribe, press the bell icon, and share. Henry is located in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Henry. It's a pleasure to have you back with us on New Thinking Aloud today.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's an honor and a delight to be with you.
In our last conversation, we talked about your wonderful book, Original Love, and the Four Inns on the Path of Awakening. And I'll link to that interview in the upper right corner of the screen for people to view that. And today we're going to go a little bit deeper into Zen and Koans. To get us started, could you share a little bit about how you started on this journey toward Zen?
Yeah, I started on meditation in my early to mid 20s, and that happened through a combination of circumstances. Primarily that I was quite unhappy, and secondarily that I had a couple of good friends who meditated. One of them was an older woman. She was, in fact, had been a kind of mentor to my mother, and became the same for me. And I had developed my own relationship with her, but although she'd been a family friend, since I'd been a kid. And she was called Flora, and she was Romanian and from Transylvania. So she was quite exotic in a certain way in London. And she was also unusual in that, I didn't know this at first, but in that she meditated. And, that just wasn't a normal thing in Britain generally in the late 1980s, and nor in the kind of milieu that I'd grown up in, which was pretty academic and, highly intellectual. But she did, and she sort of encouraged me to try it, because you could see, I wasn't hiding it. She could see I was quite unhappy. I was doing a postgraduate degree at the time, and really just suffering from anxiety and depression. And I had a really bothersome skin condition that I think we talked about some last time. And so Flora just, said, hey, I do this thing twice a day, which is like a cleansing of my psyche, of my mind and heart. It's a kind of internal hygiene. And so I got into meditation, and that was one part of what got me into the path of Zen. Actually, the meditation I got into at first was TM, or Transcendental Meditation, which, my God, it was profoundly helpful. I really, my weary, overtaxed, overburdened nervous system finally had a chance to start releasing and discharging, finding more balance, more regulation. And it was just it was just spectacular, to get that. And but it didn't really address something that I had been very curious about since the age of 19, when I'd had an extraordinary moment of a kind of revelatory nature, when it was as if I suddenly saw through my sense of being me, my sense of this experience being something called my life. Instead, it was something much sort of vaster and somehow seemed to include, even at its deepest, sort of everything, and that I was not a separate entity the way I thought I was. And so it was a really decisive and extraordinary shift in the experience of being alive. And I mean, it's not like it lasted forever. It lasted for a while. It had an intensity and then faded, and a kind of beautiful aftermath glowed in me for weeks after. But then it sort of faded and was gone, but lingered as this tantalizing memory of another way of being. And I hadn't actually had any idea what that had been. I just had no idea, except I felt very sure that it had been some kind of truth or some more real experience of what it was to be living than I'd ever had before. So in some sense, it felt like the most important thing that had ever happened to me, because it just upended all ideas I'd had about being a person and being alive. Anyway, cut forward. So then I have rather an unhappy few years at college and after, and start meditating, starting to bring more mental health and general health and balance in my life, and I get a little bit better sort of aligned with my deeper sort of possibilities in this life. I got sort of on track in a different career that was better for me, really, as a young writer. And I was very lucky, actually, to have some success young as a writer, which allowed me to do it full time for quite a while. Along the way, I discovered Zen through a new friend that I met when I was working on a book set in New Mexico, actually. So I was out in New Mexico, and this new friend meditated in the Zen style. And I realized from certain things she read to me and the conversations we had, that Zen understood very clearly the experience I'd had at the age of 19, of that sudden revelatory moment. It was a moment of what Zen called kensho, which means seeing reality. In parlance today, we'd call it an awakening experience. But I really hadn't known that at all at the time. And so therefore, I just kind of, I felt I got to do this Zen thing. And I switched from doing TM to doing Zen. And what that meant was a simpler kind of meditation. TM had a mantra that you used, and Zen, nothing, just the breath. Just the breath, just being alive. And so that's what I did for a number of years. And then at a certain point, I was actually on a retreat with a teacher who said, why don't we all start sitting with a Koan? And a Koan in Zen is a little phrase, sometimes a question, sometimes just a statement that you use in your meditation. And you might, for example, you might sort of say it in your mind on every out-breath, or you might just check in with it now and then. And the question that he gave us was, who am I? Just that. And the encouragement was, don't think about it. Just repeat it, and whatever rhythm works for you as you're meditating. And we just see what happens. And I found it very frustrating, and my mind wandered all over the place and wouldn't stay on the question until some way into this retreat, which really I was finding extremely hard. It was a week long, and you start at 5 a.m. and go to 9 p.m. It was brutal, and I was incredibly restless. And then there's this question I'm supposed to be thinking about in some way, and my mind was just all over the place, But then suddenly on deep into the retreat, near the end of it, I suddenly just locked on the question in a way. It was like something coming into focus suddenly. Like if you're looking at a microscope and it's all blurry and you can't tell what's going on, then you're twiddling the knobs, old style microscope, and then suddenly, there it is. You see the image. It was like that. Suddenly I could really feel that the question was asking me, who actually am I? Like I've got this assumption that I know who I am, that I haven't really investigated. I've just kind of taken it without really examining it. And all of a sudden, I could actually see that there was a kind of sense of me in the middle of me somewhere, and that I didn't really know what it was or why it was there. And it just evaporated. It just disappeared. And I realized it had only ever been a thought. And it was possible not to have that thought. And when I didn't have that thought, I wasn't anyone. And instead of it being some kind of horrifying loss, it was a huge gain. Because instead of being this somewhat tormented little homunculus called me, that just wasn't there. It was as if I remember feeling like I'd been on this sort of ship of life and I just assumed it had a captain. But suddenly I saw that it had never really had a captain. It was just things unfolding without a captain in the middle organizing things and arranging things. And it was extraordinary what a relief that was to realize. And so that was my first real taste of the power that these little phrases in Zen can have that are known as koans.
Reading your books, I was really impacted by how much you suffered with eczema. And how much of a role do you think that experience growing up with itching, scratching, sores all over your body, impacting your sense of self, how much did that impact your journey towards Zen? Because when you were 19, I believe you were in Bolivia?
Yeah, in South America, yeah.
Yeah. During that time, your eczema also started to decrease, right?
Yes.
So it sounds like you started noticing that there's something more going on here.
Yes, I definitely had grown up with, my own little brand of suffering, and, trauma that I had not realized was that. I just thought this is the way the world is, and I've got this affliction that, I know other people don't have it, but I do. And because it was very severe at times, that skin thing, I was in hospital at times. And yeah, it was a real torment. The itch was tremendous at times, and the pain as well. And, but it's just, I didn't know anything else. And it was really, when it started to heal for just a period of 6 months while I was abroad on a gap year between school and college when I was 18/19. It was a spectacular relief. And, also I was among people in the Andes who just had a totally different way of being. It was very sort of, rural communities that we were traveling in mostly. And they didn't have you could sort of sense that they didn't have a lot of the sort of troubled overload on their nervous systems that, the people in the highly intellectualized world I'd grown up in kind of tended to have. They were more relational and definitely had a deeper sense of relationship with the land they lived on. There was much more of a sense of reciprocity that Mother Earth, Pachamama, gives, and you have to feed Pachamama and acknowledge the gifts with gratitude. And I don't know, there was just a web of life that was more palpable, where humans were more connected with one another and with the earth on which they lived. And, their homes were all made out of earth, adobe, with straw roofs typically, and they were, they were remarkably kind and hospitable to me and the friend I was traveling with. They, and we were often we were young and foolhardy. We went on these really remote trails to totally out of the way places at 17,000 feet, and we hardly knew what we didn't know how what we were doing. We had this amazing guidebook actually that had been written by two American backpackers in the 70s who had mapped out these really remote trails, and we even went further afield than they had done, and it was an amazing time of vast sense of expansion of what the world contained, having grown up in rainy Oxford. It was all about libraries and essays and classes and learning the literature of ancient Greece and ancient Rome and France and England, basically, was the project in my childhood, and Russian as well. And suddenly it was all blown open to people living in this intimacy with our planet, in a totally different way. So really, the experience that I had, that I described, where, I suddenly wasn't separate, was a sort of almost like a culmination of that time away when, I'd actually written my first book while traveling, and I was just so happy that I could be happy, and that I could be free of the troubles of my childhood and feel so good just to be alive. And I'd written a book, and suddenly it all just somehow came together in this moment of deep kind of release, really. And I found I wasn't separate.
And when you got back home, your depression returned, your eczema returned, but you knew that something had happened to you, and you wanted to find out, how can I regain that experience, or what was that?
Yeah, that's right. I came home and had a kind of minor breakdown. I mean, it was pretty nasty, but I say minor because I was able to sort of function. I went to college and sort of struggled through college and carried on, but I was miserable, really, inside. I was depressed and anxious and kind of in despair because I'd found this marvel about the nature of life, and I'd lost it. It was terrible at the time to have lost it, and I felt I'd never get it back. And then I started meditating, and then I started some therapy, and then that led me to wanting to pick up the thread of what had that incredible experience been. Because I knew it was still, like, in some way the most important thing I'd experienced, because it was about life itself,
What is Zen?
That's a great question. On one level, Zen is a form of Buddhism that developed in China about somewhere between the 1st and 6th centuries CE. And it's some kind of blending of Buddhism with Taoism. And there are different forms of Zen. And the one that I landed in is one that is explicitly interested in the experience of awakening, of the discovery of this reality. They sometimes, some people call it non-duality, or the non-dual, because it's where the separation of me and the world as two things, as a duality, that suddenly vanishes. And on some level, everything's just one thing. Yeah, there's different schools of Zen, but the underlying thing somehow is that kind of experience is real, meaning both that it really happens to people, and also that when it happens, it's a revelation of something real. It's not a delusional, it's not even, I would say, an altered state, actually. That implies in some way that, almost like there's some distortion of our ordinary mind. Zen would say it's the other way around, that our ordinary, real, authentic mind is that, actually. And that we've developed this distortion of thinking that we're totally separate and got disconnected from what it calls our original nature. Okay, so that's a bit of kind of what it is in some sense, but what it really boils down to is just kind of a practice of being still and quiet for some period of time every day. If we do that, we're doing Zen.
Yeah. The type of Zen meditation you practiced when you wrote your book, you describe how you would sit and stare at a wall and count to 10, and then repeat that again with the breath. Can you share a little bit about how your practice of Zen is different or similar to other forms of meditation?
Yeah. So, a lot of meditation traditions concur on one thing, which is following the breath. So for sure Zen does that. And one of the ways you can do that in Zen is by counting the breath. You count 1 on an inhale, 2 on an exhale, and keep going till you reach 10. And then you start again at 1. And it's surprising how hard that is to do. It's such a simple thing, but it actually, once we start trying to do it, we realize, oh my gosh, my mind just slides off. I only got to 2 and I didn't even realize it. And suddenly, oh man, where did I get to? I only got to 2. So we come back and start again. So they say, fall down 7 times, get up 8 times. Fall down 7,000 times, get up 7,001 times in Zen. So we don't expect to be able to do it. We're just slowly, bit by bit, doing 2 things. One is training our minds to find a way to be more stable in holding our attention on something. And secondly, we're learning just how our minds often behave. That we really have a lot of thoughts that just come, it's very easy not to notice thoughts because they pick us up and we get absorbed in them before we know it. And we can be in these intense imaginary experiences of where we're sort of, we imagine we're in a scene, we're having a conversation with somebody, we're hearing it, we're seeing them, we're having emotions, and it's all just actually just thoughts in the mind, and so becoming more cognizant of that is a great training for anybody. And many schools of meditation, they do just that, and they'll use the breath as the point of return, the anchor, which we don't expect to stay anchored to, but we can keep coming back to it. So Zen is no exception there. I mean, you can, and by the way, and the staring at the wall thing, yeah, that's a peculiarity of Zen and some other Buddhist traditions, where you sit not with eyes closed, but with eyes open, with the gaze kind of lowered, and you just let the wall be there. And actually, it can become very beautiful. You can really, as we keep practicing, we will find that we do get periods when we're just very clearly present. There's just a peaceful, kind of energized sense of presence. And the wall is right there. The wall can become like sort of a close friend almost. We can get it can become so beautiful, a blank wall that's just there, and it's funny, it can become very, very beautiful. And the experience of just sitting with no extras, Zen is very sort of simple, doesn't have elaborate iconography, A typical Zendo might just basically be a bare room with some chairs and some cushions. And perhaps there's a simple altar, which would just be a bare, thin table with maybe just a bowl for incense and a candle. And in some cases there might be a little figurine of a Buddha sitting there, but it's super simple. And, ideally, you walk into a Zen meditation hall or a Zendo, and you get this sense right away of a kind of clarity, a peacefulness, and a simplicity that is very lovely for the human soul. It's like walking into a space that's warm and welcoming and has a kind of human-shaped kindness in it, even though it's just so bare and simple, ideally.
What do the eyes being open, what does that do for a person versus the eyes being closed?
Yes, that's a great question as well. Here's one way of looking at it. They say in Zen, we don't block our ears when we meditate. Why, therefore, should we close our eyes, kind of thing? All senses are open. And there's pros and cons of lots of these different meditation subtleties of technique. And with eyes open, one of the good things, one of the pros is that we go through life, our days, with our eyes open. And one of the kind of hopes along the path of meditation is that the more clear our awareness can get in meditation, the more we want to learn to bring that into every moment of our lives. So that it's not like I sit down to meditate and that's one little separate world, and the moment I get up I just forget all about that and I'm back into my old habits of mind and being caught up in emotion and thought and so on. We want to see if we can bring the kind awareness that we're finding in meditation into our lives. And if we have eyes open when meditating, it's that little step closer to being like normal life, and therefore maybe easier to do that. And, cons would be that sometimes it's just easier to concentrate if we close our eyes, So there's pros and cons every which way.
Yeah. There may be people listening thinking, well, am I just supposed to stop my thoughts and disappear? Or what is the goal or intention?
Yeah, that's great. I'd say, there are several possibilities that meditation can help us with, Zen included. And one would be all that comes under the heading of mindfulness. And this is the first in my book of Original Love. It's developing more capacity to rest in, I think, a kind of loving awareness that is appreciative of the experience of this moment, that can hold our trauma, can hold our difficult emotion, and it's a kind of self-kindness that is, I think, part and parcel of mindfulness. And it has a flavor of a kind of gratitude as well, that we cherish things more when we're getting more mindful, and we tend to be less reactive. We're better at, we hope we're getting better at responding more helpfully rather than kind of blindly reacting to things. And that's all great. And that's one of the things that can truly develop through this simple style of meditation. But another is, and this is like the second in of my book, is like finding much more connectedness. That, it's easy to think of meditation as a solo activity. But actually, I believe that it's always about discovering how we're not so alone. Of course, sometimes that's literally, we might just meditate with other people. Sometimes we might have guidance in our meditation. But it's not only that, it's more, softening the sense of the boundary between me and the world, recognizing that I'm a product of the world. I'm the planet, in a way. I'm just the planet taking the shape of a human being. I'm totally made of this planet, and here I am talking and walking and thinking and being aware. But I'm really just a piece of the planet doing that, as we all are. So sort of getting more of a sense of our connectivity and our connectedness and our debt, to everything that gives us our life. That's another fruit of it. And then the third in my book is actually about getting into flow states, which meditation can really help happen in our lives. Both when we're meditating, we can get into these really lovely states of mind where time seems to stop. There's a sense of great ease and a kind of fulfillment. It's very beautiful, and but it can also, I've found, and I think many others too, that it can also help us find flow in other activities in life. The fact that we're meditating just a little bit every day will make us more prone to dropping into flow through our lives. And that's just sweet,
Yeah.
And then, of course, it can help with this great business of awakening. Sometimes we get so absorbed in the meditation that we just fall all the way in, and we kind of vanish in a great sense of oneness. And that can come on both in the meditation or, again, not while meditating. It's not uncommon for people to have glimpses of that, sometimes really strong ones, when they're doing housework or shopping or driving or, just going through their day in some normal moment. Unexpectedly, all of a sudden, it hits them. Oh my gosh, I'm part of everything, and the meditation is subtly preparing us to realize those things.
That was the experience you had in South America. And one might also equate that to a form of quantum entanglement. So I have two questions here. How do we sustain that in life? How do we gain it, sustain it, which was really also what your journey was about? Yeah. And what have you discovered since you were 19 about that experience?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I mean, what I've found in a nutshell is that that first experience was not the end of the road. It felt like a total. There was nothing more to realize. It was like I found out what I really am, and actually I could die then and there because I'd fulfilled my life in some way, was how I felt at the time. But I didn't die, mercifully, and I'm still here, and I've gone on, and I've learned a whole ton more. That there's more we can experience. I've been, greatly blessed to have some fantastic teachers who've led me deeper and deeper, and in particular on the Koan path, where we were talking about Koans a little earlier. There's actually collections of Koans that, in the tradition I was trained in, you work through these old books, and you sit with each Koan, and you meet one-on-one with your teacher to sort of go through the Koan with them, and they may say, "Great, you got it," or "No, you haven't really got this one yet," and you keep sitting with it, and going through that process more than once actually. What it did for me is it just wore down more and more of my resistance and more of my tendency to contract into, a separate sense of me. And I should say a little bit more about that, but not right. Just finish this thought now. That actually it opened up deeper kinds of openings, that were deeper than what had happened to me in South America. And finally, it's really possible to have to go through a sort of shift where it seems like it's much easier to stay open thereafter. And it's not necessarily that we're walking around in a totally bedazzled state of mind all the time, when we can be kind of normal, but we haven't got the resistance forming repeatedly, where we sort of resist life and we stay open. And that's I think a really beautiful fruit of practice that's definitely possible. And in my own case, that, to whatever small extent that's come about, it's been through ongoing sitting, and some training under teachers and just, keeping going. It's sort of, I love meditating, and I kind of hope everybody who's drawn to it will find a way to love it. And that, that's actually what I try to really help in our app, The Way, where it's really finding a way to love this practice. So you want to do it. Because a lot of people want to do it, but find it's kind of hard, and they try a bit, they bounce off, they try a bit, they bounce off again. And so we try to construct a pathway that helps sort of guide a user into really loving it, so they don't want to miss a day,
What is a koan?
Yeah.
Is that a koan unto itself, Henry?
It is actually. Yeah, we're still trying to answer that. After millennia of sitting with koans, nobody knows really what a koan is. They're weird little phrases, that have come down. They're things that an enlightened master said at some point, either in the early days of Buddhism in India or in those early centuries of Buddhism in China. That's when they mostly got recorded. That somebody asked, what is awakening? Answer is, it's a rice cake. That's one koan, Well, what does that mean? Awakening is a rice cake,
If you happen to like rice cakes, it could be really good.
Yes, exactly. I don't know, another one is, what is the essence of Buddhism? And the master says, so he's asked, what is the essence of Buddhism? What's the heart of this practice of awakening? And his answer is, what is the price of rice in Luling? So Luling was a market town near where this master lived. So what is the heart of awakening? Answer, what is the price of rice in Luling? So, so it's mysterious and it seems to make no sense, but we just sit with the phrase, what is awakening? What is the price of rice in Luling? What is the price of rice in Luling? And so we don't try to figure it out. We just let ourselves sit with that phrase, the price of rice in Luling. And, often we might just find it so baffling we don't want to go there, but not uncommonly we might just get some strange sense of peace and quiet that seems to come with the phrase. We just kind of stay with it. We stay with whatever gentle invitation it seems to be offering without trying to figure anything out. And it does actually happen that something may just shift and we just get a different sense of things that's more open and easy and brings in somehow more appreciation for this very moment, here and now.
Being present, loving, kind, of service. In your book, One Blade of Grass, that's what you mentioned is what seems to be essential or paramount with Zen.
Yes, I think that's an aspiration, that we would be more present more of the time, less caught up in our own agenda, and more oriented towards the needs of others, and therefore wishing to be more of service in this world, as the way in whatever ways we're called to serve, to offer our lives for the benefit of other beings in this world, because we're not so caught up. I mean, this is what we aspire to, not so caught up in me, I, me, mine. It's got a little less magnetic, and so we're freer, and that's I think that's a good thing in the world, to have more people who are aspiring to live like that. And of course, in no sense would I think for a minute that Zen is the only way to get there. Not at all,
Mm-hmm. What have koans done for you?
Well, in my case, they've really helped me stay more open and or to be more easily untangled when I get caught up in my sense of self. And when I get tightened and contracted in some way, they help me loosen that and remember that there's a larger picture. There's always a bigger picture and a wider perspective. There's also kind of, they can be quite fun if sometimes I meet with other teachers of koans and we just sort of have a good time messing around with them and sort of challenging each other on them and stuff and just seeing how much we can let go and not care what anybody else thinks, or that they're purveyors of a great deal of freedom, human freedom, and love. They bring us back to some people call it the ground of being, some fundamental nature that we share with everything.
Is there one answer for these koans, or is it just part of your own evolution at that moment, being a student on the path when you meet with your teacher? Or how do you then pass to the next koan? And when do they feel you've got it?
Yeah, well, there are different ways of working with them. And in the really traditional way that I've been through myself, you are actually you're encouraged to not talk about the koan, but embody it. It's called embodying it and presenting it. That you actually are waiting for some kind of gesture that expresses the koan, and a lot of them that could be many different things, but in some of them actually there is an expected response. And it's funny how that will often just come up by itself, and you find yourself doing something that you hadn't premeditated. It just comes up and you do it, and teacher smiles and the room changes. You feel this sort of energy in the room, and you got it. You just feel it in your bones. That's what the koan was inviting, so that can be part of it. Yeah. Which is kind of weird, and you can then talk about it as well. But usually, first there'll be this presentation.
Are you able to give us an example of one, or that's, I suppose, for the student to discover in their process of practicing Zen?
Yes, that's probably the correct approach.
Yeah.
But I could tell you a bit about it. It's like what's fun, I think, about them. And I mean, when we start getting them, is that they don't really engage the mind. They seem to. You think, I'm thinking about this, because I'm running it through my mind, the little phrase, whatever it is. But they actually, when they come alive in us, it's not the mind at work. It's somehow they get into the body, and they kind of use your body like a glove. It's almost like a hand reaches in and turns you into a glove puppet, and you sort of do something that the koan has asking you to do, but you didn't realize you were going to do. The point being, really, they're not about our cognitive mind. They're kind of some other way of being that they're helping to grow.
When you were working with them and you felt, aha, I have it, and you presented it to your teacher, do you feel like you were connecting to your intuition or to a larger pool of knowledge or insight?
I would feel like I was connecting to this fundamental nature that is boundless and is all-inclusive. And I'm very interested in what that has to do with intuition. To what extent is intuition coming out of our fundamental nature? We may not recognize our fundamental nature in that moment, but the fact that we're getting these hints and nudges, and it's often in the body that I feel intuitive hunches, that maybe they are somehow emerging from that shared, connected place of original nature,
And that seems like it would make a lot of sense that when you connect to this larger knowing, the oneness that you're accessing, one might say intuitive awareness, it's just a term, but accessing that knowing, that information, that maybe then your teachers thought, aha, you were able to settle the mind enough and allow that to come forward, perhaps?
Yes, I think that's a good way of putting it, actually. I think something like that is going on. As we just sort of settle down and our sense of needing to be me it gets quieter, gets softer, more relaxed, and sometimes even, sort of drops away, then we're in this space where we don't have to be so driven by our agenda. It can be a sort of agenda-free zone, and it's still, and it's quiet, and it's now, and somehow everything is here. And we because we're not so called by our agendas for what we should be trying to do and thinking ahead to what's coming next and being pulled by the next moment, because that's gone, we're resting and sort of abiding in a great peace, actually. It's very sort of energized as well. But it is a kind of peace. It's an unfolding place of peace, and it's, I think it's a marvelous property of our human nature, really, that we have that capacity to drop into it.
Meditation and koans go hand in hand. So, for example, if somebody listening wants to understand a koan, might you suggest that they have a regular meditation practice for them to be successful? Or at what point in a training do the koans become invited in?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Emily. To have a ongoing, sort of fairly steady meditation practice is greatly beneficial for picking up koans. And normally a Zen teacher wouldn't really encourage somebody to get too much into koans until they've got a steady practice. And actually, on our app, The Way, we bring in koans, but only once people have gone a certain way along the pathway, so that they are getting into a steady rhythm with their practice. We hope, and then we bring in the koans.
Mm-hmm.
I feel that they're like fertilizer for us humans. They can open up our minds in ways we didn't know that they could do that. There's a saying in Zen that let the mind flower bloom. That somehow they don't mean it too literally, I think, but that there's properties of our consciousness that can show themselves to us through meditation, and koans can accelerate that and fertilize that, nourish that process.
We touched on this in the previous interview. Can you share a little bit about, through your experience of being a Zen student, now an advanced teacher, when did you have an experience that was similar or echoed that experience you had when you were 19, that spontaneous experience of unity consciousness or awakening?
Yeah, at various points in my Zen process, there were more experiences like that, kind of sort of same terrain as that, but every single one was totally new and unexpected, but sort of same terrain, but utterly different as well. And one of them was a really decisive one when really it was like everything just disappeared, and there wasn't even consciousness for some space that I don't really know how long, but not very long, I think. But it came back, and it was different. Everything I'd somehow fallen into this. It felt like I just tumbled into this source point where there just is actually nothing, but at the same time, it's generating everything. And it was definitely the most powerful experience that I ever had. And it was life changing. After that, something was really different, that it never really reverted after that.
Mm.
And it was sort of in the, year or two after that my teachers started to express the desire that I become a teacher as well, and I was in a training for that, and gradually getting more responsibility as that went along. But it was, so yes, I think these things can happen, and there may be more than one, in a lifetime.
Yeah, it seems like your experiences kept deepening you to this oneness while also healing you from your sense of loss, grief from growing up, separation, and some might refer to it as ego or the attachments that we have.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And I mean, my hunch is that it's, those sudden, more kind of dramatic moments are part of that process, but so is everything else. Just the gradual bumping up against my sharp corners, the ways I've got work to do on my personality, and which of course I still do as a work in progress. And and having the relationships I have, and being in the communities that I'm part of, all of that is also part of the growth process. I think it's easy to get a sense that, it's these decisive, existential, explosive insights that what really matter. But I suspect it's not. They can be profoundly helpful, it's true, but I think they're part of an overall path of growing and hopefully maturing and growing up. And, and we have heartbreaks can be very, very great teachers as well. Difficult things that happen.
And life experiences.
Yes, exactly. All of life. They say in Zen, like, every single moment is our teacher.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yes, one of the things I love about Zen as a path is that it's very concerned with, our embodied life in the world. It's not really, it doesn't really think, we're done if we're sort of thoroughly enlightened in a monastery. It thinks we got to be living ordinary life. How does your practice hold up in ordinary life?
Yeah, and in relationships, not only to ourselves, but with others. People we like and people we think we don't like.
Exactly. How do we handle antipathy, ill will? What do we do if that comes up in us? Can we recognize and allow for the fact that it does at times, and not live in some sort of artificial state of thinking I'm above all that? Well, probably not, actually. It's more like, how do we deal with the difficulties than rising above them,
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, you're doing a beautiful job verbally sharing something that is not necessarily easy to put into words.
Well, thank you for saying that. I mean, I'm trying. You know, I hope I'm doing my best, and I know it's deficient, but you're very encouraging, and thank you.
Can you describe the story of the one blade of grass in relationship to the practice of Zen?
So yeah, there's a story about how the practice of Zen Buddhism came from India, where it had developed, with Shakyamuni, you know, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. From Buddha and Buddha's time onwards, it came to China, according to a legend, with a particular Zen monk or master called Bodhidharma. And he's said to have crossed the Yangtze River on a single blade of grass. And, you know, whatever we make of that legend, you know, presumably not exact history, but the suggestion is that it's actually a very sort of frail and slight raft that brings this into our life. It's subtle, you know, it's just a single blade of grass, but it can make such a huge difference. You know, it can really, because Zen became this, you know, flourishing practice that really sort of was a prime spiritual practice of China for it depends how you count it, but at least hundreds of years, and was behind a lot of the marvelous culture of China, and then of other East Asian countries, Vietnam and Korea and Japan, you know, and yet it came from such a humble, slight beginning, you know, and I think that's rather beautiful when the practice itself is just being still and quiet for a little bit every day. You know, that too is somehow humble and slight. It's not like a great load of learning that we have to do. You know, it's not like, you know, learning chemistry and dozens of textbooks or something. You know, it's just being still and quiet, and that there's so much richness that we can learn from just these little periods of quiet and stillness.
Is there anything else you want to share today about Zen and Koans?
You know, one of the deepest koans is just one little word, which is ah, just the letter A, ah. So I love the fact that it's just basically one out-breath, ah. And the promise, you know, of it, the fact that that's a koan, it means that it's promising that somehow everything we need is in that little sound, that single syllable, ah.
Beautiful, Henry. Thank you so much for the inspiration, for sharing with us, for teaching us, and being with us today. I really enjoyed this conversation once again.
Well, Emmy, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a real honor and delight for me. Very, very lovely to be able to converse with you like this. I'm very grateful to you. Thank you.
And I'm very grateful to you as well. And I am the one who has all the honor. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here. Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy.